On the afternoon of the 8th of October, 1871, a French priest in northern Wisconsin walked out into his garden and began to dig a hole. Into it, he put his books and the ornaments from his church. He covered them over with sand. Father Peter Pernin could not have told you why he was doing it. Nothing had happened. The air was dead still. There was smoke on the horizon, but there had been smoke on that horizon since July, and there had been no rain to speak of since summer. He simply had a feeling he could not argue himself out of. 9 hours later, Peter Pernin was standing chest deep in the Peshtigo River in the dark, blind, with the sky on fire above him. He would stay in that water for 5.5 hours. By morning, the town of Peshtigo did not exist. Every building, every street, every wooden sidewalk. Somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 people were dead. Nobody has ever been able to say exactly how many, and I'll come back to why. It is the deadliest fire in American history. It has never been surpassed, and you have almost certainly never heard of it, because on the very same night, 250 miles to the south, a barn caught fire in Chicago. Every account of the Peshtigo fire tells you it was overshadowed by the Great Chicago Fire. That is true, and it is where nearly all of them stop. But overshadowed makes it sound like bad luck, like a coin that landed the wrong way. What actually happened is colder than that. The Peshtigo fire destroyed the town's ability to report its own destruction. The fire burned the telegraph lines. It burned them for miles. The nearest working telegraph key was 45 miles away, in Green Bay, across country that was itself on fire. So Peshtigo could not tell anyone that it was dying, and it could not tell anyone afterwards that it was dead. It took 2 days for word to reach the state capitol at Madison. 2 days in which the entire American press, every reporter, every wire, every column inch, was pointed at Chicago, where a great city had burned, and roughly 300 people had been killed. Peshtigo killed at least 4 times that many, probably more. By the time Wisconsin's own governor learned that a town in his own state had been erased, he had already left for Chicago with the relief supplies. Understand what Peshtigo was. It was a lumber town on the Peshtigo River, about 250 miles north of Chicago, holding close to 2,000 people, including Germans, Norwegians, Belgians, Irish, and French Canadians, brought over to cut the great white pine forests of Wisconsin and turn them into things. Peshtigo was home to the largest woodenware factory in the world. It made clothespins, buckets, barrels, broom handles, tubs, and the town itself was made out of what the factory made things from. The buildings were wood, the sidewalks were wood, the roads were surfaced with sawdust and wood chips, because the mills produced more of it than anyone knew what to do with, and it made a soft, cheap street. Peshtigo was, quite literally, a town built on sawdust. Around it in every direction lay the cutover. When loggers took the pine, they left the branches, the tops, the bark, a waste layer called slash, sometimes meters deep, drying across hundreds of square miles. And 1871 was the driest year anyone could remember. In Chicago, leaves had begun dropping from the trees in July. There had been fires in the woods around Peshtigo for weeks. Small ones, constant ones. The air was thick enough that ships on Green Bay were navigating by compass. The people of Peshtigo were not fools, and they were not unprepared. Pernin records that barrels of water had been set out at intervals through the town, ready. But what came for them on the night of the 8th of October was not a fire, in any sense they understood. A cold front moved through the upper Midwest that evening, and the wind came up hard behind it, and it took every one of those small, smoldering fires and fused them into one. Pernin describes the strangest thing first. Not heat, not light, but a silence, an unnatural stillness settling over the town. And then, out of the west, under the smoke, a low red glow, and a sound. He wrote that it was a distant roaring, muffled, like something enormous in commotion a long way off. Nobody in Peshtigo had ever heard anything like it, because almost nobody in the world had. What was coming toward them, at something like 100 miles an hour, was a wall of fire 5 miles wide. What hit Peshtigo was not a forest fire. It was a firestorm. A fire so large it generates its own weather, sucking air into itself with such violence that it produces winds strong enough to level a town before the flames even arrive. Survivors described a tornado of fire. It threw railway cars into the air. It picked up houses. Witnesses in the nearby settlement of Williamsonville watched a rotating column of flame come across open ground. The heat was beyond anything they had a category for. It melted the bell in Pernin's church. It fused patches of sand into glass. Afterwards, there were holes in the ground where the fire had followed tree roots down and burned them out to their ends. Birds died in the air. Pernin's instinct when it came was to save the tabernacle from his church, the vessel that holds the consecrated host, the most sacred object he was responsible for. He loaded it onto a wagon and dragged it through a town in total panic toward the river. In the crush at the bank, the wagon was shoved into the water. The tabernacle went with it and floated away into the dark, and Pernin let it go, because by then the only thing left to save was himself. He got into the Peshtigo River at about 10 o'clock at night. He stayed in it for 5.5 hours. And this is the part people do not understand about the river. The river was not safety. The air above it was full of fire. People had to keep ducking their heads under and splashing water over anyone whose hair or clothing began to smoke. Some were swept away by the current. Some drowned. Some, in the freezing October water, hour after hour, while the sky burned, simply died of the cold. Cattle went into the river alongside the people and thrashed among them in the dark. Pernin looked around him from the water and wrote afterwards that in every direction, right, left, ahead, above, he could see nothing that was not on fire. The houses, the trees, the air itself. He went blind. Whether from the heat or the smoke, he could not see, and he did not know if it would be permanent. The fire went through the town of Peshtigo, from first flame to finished, in about an hour. When it was light enough to see, 2 structures were standing in Peshtigo. A brick kiln, and one unfinished house, built of green timber so fresh it had not dried out enough to burn. Everything else was ash. The fire had burned something like 1.2 to 1.5 million acres across 6 Wisconsin counties and into Michigan, roughly 2,400 square miles, about the size of Delaware. It destroyed 16 towns. Some of them, like Williamsonville, were never rebuilt and do not exist today. And the dead could not be counted. The 1873 report to the Wisconsin legislature listed 1,182 names of the dead and missing, but the town's records had burned. The immigrant laborers in the logging camps had never been fully counted while they were alive, and bodies were recovered that nobody could name. More than 350 of them were put into a single mass grave, unidentified, because everyone who might have recognized them was also dead. The honest figure is a range between 1,200 and 2,500 people. It will never be narrower than that. The fire consumed the evidence of itself. That is at least 4 times the toll of the Great Chicago Fire, on the same night, in the same hours. So here is what was happening while Peshtigo was trying to get word out through 45 miles of burning forest. Wisconsin's governor, Lucius Fairchild, had done the decent thing. He had loaded relief supplies and gone to Chicago because Chicago was the disaster America knew about, and Chicago was where every telegraph in the country said the help was needed. He was not in Madison when the news from Peshtigo finally arrived. 2 days late, his wife was. Frances Fairchild heard what had happened in the north of her own state, and she went down to the railway, and she found a train car already loaded with food and supplies and pointed at Chicago, and she stopped it and had it turned around and sent it to Peshtigo instead. Then she organized a blanket drive across Madison and sent the bedding north after it. The first meaningful relief that reached the deadliest fire in the history of the United States reached it because the governor's wife took a train that was going somewhere else. And it is worth saying plainly what that means. Even the aid was going to Chicago. The forgetting of Peshtigo did not begin decades later in the history books. It began within 48 hours, while the survivors were still standing in the river. The morning after the fire, the tabernacle from Peter Pernin's church was found in the Peshtigo River, sitting upright on a log, dry. Pernin, who had every reason to want a miracle and every incentive to claim one, refused to call it one. He wrote about it, and he declined to give it a name. He rebuilt both his churches. He wrote his account of the fire in French and English and published it in Montreal in 1874 under the title, "The Finger of God is There." He wrote it, in part, to raise the money to rebuild. The single most important eyewitness record of the deadliest fire in American history exists because a parish priest needed building funds. He lived until 1909. And here is the thing that has not been resolved and that you can go and look at yourself. The Wisconsin legislature took evidence about the fire in 1873. That evidence, the appendices to the Assembly Journal, the testimony, the accounting of the dead, still exists. And more than a century and a half later, the Wisconsin Historical Society itself notes, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that almost nobody who has written about the Peshtigo fire appears to have gone and read it. The deadliest fire in American history burned the wires that could have told the country it was happening. It burned the records that could have counted the dead. And the one record that survived, we never opened. The town could not make itself heard on the night. It is not obvious that it has managed to since.